We all must breathe. You must breathe. I must breathe. And this car must breathe through this airbox that I made. Let me show you how I made it.
You saw the car running in the last episode and pulling air through this box. It looks like a factory piece, but it is not. Here is how it was made. This is the mass airflow sensor and rubber bellows from the LS air intake. On front of that is what is left of the resonator box that I've already hacked up. But I need to hack it up some more, so I don't need that. And this other part can go too. The hacked up resonator box will be part of the new air filter assembly that I have to make. So after it's put back on the intake, I'm using masking tape to mark its position on the bottom and measuring from the firewall to mark its upper position. The airflow sensor is moved out of the way so an air cleaner lid for a 3rd Gen F body can be installed. This assembly fed air to the tune port injected V8s that came in the IROC Z and regular Z28 Camaros. I'm using more masking tape to mark where the hacked up resonator box ended over the radiator upper mount cap. Unfortunately for me, is that the exit hole in this air cleaner lid is not only too small to feed the LS engine, but it also sits at the wrong angle. This is a rare piece that is extremely hard to find nowadays, so let's take it to the bench and cut it up. The side cutter makes quick work of cutting off the back part of the lid assembly. So now that it's apart, oh wait, maybe not. Some more cutting, now that it's still not apart. Now it's cut apart. Stupid piece of shit. Back at the front of the car, the mass airflow sensor is reinstalled. Don't need this anymore. Then the chopped up air cleaner lid is installed so we can check the fitment of the two parts together. But the back piece sticks up higher. But it still fits under the hood, so we are all good. Haha, that rhymes. I cut more material out of the air cleaner lid off camera. And I say off camera meaning I forgot to film it. With the use of my 3 hands, I hold stuff out of the way so I can place masking tape under the air cleaner lid so the two hacked up pieces can be joined together, and because I am super anal about these things, the parts are carefully positioned so they line up properly. This is an epoxy made by 3M called panel Bonnet Adhesive. It is primarily used to glue metal together permanently, but it also works great on various plastics, so it's getting used to glue these pieces together. More masking tape is brought in to do 2 things. It smooths out the epoxy I just put on and will hold the base of both pieces down to the upper radiator mount cap. This prepares it for the next step, which is to put more epoxy on a Bondo spreader and press this into the bottom of the upper part of both pieces. The epoxy will not stick to the spreader once it has cured. And by clamping the spreader in place, the level of the front piece is raised to meet the back piece, which is why the sides of it were cut out, in case you were wondering why I did that. Then more epoxy is put on top. The next day after the epoxy cured, I started on the molds that will produce the parts that will fill in the giant gaping holes on the sides of the newly modified air cleaner lid. Starting with some electrical conduit that is easily bent to shape to replicate the curves in the lid. Something will have to fill in the space not filled by the conduit. So I will be a total idiot and not wear safety glasses while throwing hot burning sparks directly into my face as this sheet metal is cut. My third hand wasn't available to help, so some masking tape holds the conduit in place in preparation for the sheet metal to be tack welded in place. I need to be careful while doing this because the heat from the welding could melt the plastic and cause it to glue itself to the metal. Well, tragedy averted. I'll just grind off the molten plastic before welding on additional metal and trimming off the excess. Instead of masking tape, some self-tapping screws will now hold the upper half of the mold in place. More sheet metal is cut and tack welded in place. But this time steps were taken to avoid heat damage. After removing the screws holding in the mold, I made sure it would pass through the big hole on the end. Only it didn't, so I have to slightly modify it so that it will. Does it pass through the hole now? Yes. Yes, it does. Terrific. Yeah, this is a jigsaw. Why, you ask? When you're cutting plastic like these scraps from an old cooling fan shroud, the jigsaw makes quick and clean cuts. Why cut up an old fan shroud? It's made of a similar plastic that the air cleaner is made of. And I only made the metal molds so that I could clamp the plastic to them and shape that plastic using a lot of heat and this handy shaping tool, also known as a hammer. Both molds will serve an additional purpose, which you will get to see soon enough, but for that to work, these molds had to be super smooth. To accomplish that, we start with both molds getting a generous coating of body filler. A quick power sanding to knock down the worst parts, followed by a crap load of hand sanding with finer and finer grit sandpaper. Then they're both clean and coated with high build primer. And then more hand sanding. Finally, both molds get a wipe down with paste wax that will be used as a releasing agent for the next step. This is the same epoxy used earlier to join the front and back halves of the air cleaner lid. The plastic pieces are not perfect by any means, so I'm using this as a way to make the insides very smooth. The first thing is to give the pieces a good slathering of the stuff. Splat! Oops! The waxed up molds get pressed into the cut up and reshaped cooling shroud bits and will form the inside curves of the parts once they're installed onto the air cleaner lid. The epoxy is squeezed into all the voids, pushing out any air bubbles. Masking tape will hold the parts together while the epoxy cures overnight. I've never attempted this before, so this is a prototype proof of concept type thing for me. This is a messy ordeal and I certainly hope it works.
After unwrapping the pieces from the molds, I'm happy to announce that the wax did its job and the pieces separated with very minimal effort. And on top of that, I'm also happy to say that the pieces turned out pretty nice and smooth. So now all I have to do is clean up the outside, make them really smooth, and attach them to the air cleaner assembly.
So here we go, more sanding. After another coat of wax, the molds were reinstalled in the lid. These will support the plastic pieces while the epoxy cures. The same epoxy in the last steps will be spread all over the parts, then the pieces pushed in place. I never want this box to come apart, so I'm using plenty of glue. Masking tape is used once again to hold the pieces together. Then the whole process is repeated for the other side. I took care to make sure all the cracks were covered by the epoxy and supported by tape. Then it's just a matter of letting it sit overnight to cure. The next day the tape was removed to see how ugly it turned out. Then I took out the screws holding in the molds. Now you can see why it was important that they fit through the big hole in the end. There's no way they would have come out otherwise. This air cleaner lid is once again a single piece, but I'm going to rough it up with a good sanding one more time so I can add a layer of protection. And by a layer of protection, I mean another layer of the epoxy, because I need to fill in the tiny holes left by the screws I took out. And I wanted to add some fiberglass to reinforce the structure so it will never come apart. Essentially, I made my own FRP composite, or fiberglass reinforced plastic, which is something the OEMs have been doing for decades now. So enjoy watching the process of creating this FRP. Unless the camera's battery dies and stops filming it. Well, the next day after the epoxy was cured, the lid was unwrapped and then ground and sanded to make it look good.
This intake box is finally getting to be the shape that I want it to be. And now I'm going to focus on getting it all smooth out and pretty. But I do have a few pinholes I need to take care of. These little spots, little tiny spots that have a little bit of shininess and a little tiny crater have to be cleaned out because the next step, the next type of epoxy I'm putting on won't adhere to that shiny surface. So I have to dig all those holes out. But good thing is there's only about somewhere around 270,000 of them to dig out. So it shouldn't take too long.
This epoxy, also made by 3M, is an easily sanded and flexible plastic once it is cured. It also spreads very easily with a Bondo spreader and will hopefully fill in the majority of the pinholes as well as smooth out any slight waviness left by the previous steps. Once again, it's more sanding, only this time it has to be finished out and blocked by hand to get the smoothest finish possible. Needless to say, a lot of priming and hand sanding with fine grit paper was necessary because this will be the first thing seen when the hood is raised, so it needs to be pretty. It may seem counterproductive to do all that work and then use spray paint as the finish coat, but fear not. I bought the finest spray paint that $12 could buy. And I'm going for a satin finish instead of a gloss, so spray paint is just fine. But since it's glossy while it's still wet, have a gander at the finished product. The next day the paint was cured, so I proceeded to put on some self-adhesive foam rubber. The original piece had this on the bottom, presumably to keep the lid from rattling on the radiator support upper cap. So I thought it was a good idea, so I replicated it. Next, this rubber grommet goes in that holds a sensor for measuring inlet air temperature. Then the rest of the masking tape came off the opening ports. It feels really good to install the mass airflow meter onto the lid for the final time. Finally, the finished air cleaner lid is installed onto the car. Oh yeah, that looks good.
As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.